And just as an announcement, if we don't get to your questions tonight, Dr. Licona will be available tomorrow in the Fireside Lounge from 1 to 2 if you do have questions and don't get them answered. Sorry if we can't get to everybody tonight.
I'll also remain after if you want to, as long as you need.
Could you talk about Josephus' writings talking about Jesus? What historians think about that?
Okay, yeah, okay. What about Josephus? Josephus mentions Jesus on 2 occasions. They're both in Antiquities of the Jews. By the way, Josephus was a Jewish historian born around the year 37 in Jerusalem to a popular Jewish priest named Matthias. Josephus grew up in Jerusalem. Josephus hated the Romans, fought the Romans, was defeated by the Romans, joined the Romans, became the court historian for the Roman Emperor Vespasian. He wrote an autobiography. He wrote another work called the Jewish War, and then he wrote a history of the Jews, also called Antiquities of the Jews. He mentions Jesus twice in Antiquities of the Jews. The first is in Book 18, Section 3. It's a disputed passage. I'll mention it more in a moment. The second is in Book 20, Section 200. Just in passing, he mentions the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Messiah. All right, so the second passage I mentioned is virtually undisputed by Josephus scholars, specialists in Josephus. The first passage, however, is disputed because that passage says that there was this man named Jesus. He was the Messiah. He performed many miracles. He gained a following from Jews and Gentiles. The Pilate, at the instigation of the Jewish leaders, crucified him, but his disciples didn't abandon discipleship of him, following him, but because Jesus rose from the dead 3 days later. All right, so that's what the Greek text that we have surviving says. But the earliest manuscript is, I think, the 11th century. However, we do have Eusebius in the 4th century who mentions the same text, so we know it existed back then. Problem is that Origen, at the beginning of the 3rd century, said Josephus was not a Christian. So he was an early church father. So if that were the case, he probably wouldn't have said Jesus was the Messiah and that he rose from the dead. But yet this is what the text says, so how do we deal with this? Louis Feldman is perhaps the leading Josephus scholar in the world. He is not a Christian, he's a Jewish scholar, and he has actually done a bean count up through 1987, and then I contacted him, I think in 2001, and he said, well, I haven't done a bean count since 1987. From 1939 to 1987, Josephus scholars, he did the bean count. But he says he hadn't done it since then, but he was in touch with Josephus scholarship. And I said, so most Josephus scholars believe that a Christian, probably from the 2nd or 3rd century, doctored up Josephus, what he actually said in that first text. So what did he originally say? We can't know for sure. But most Josephus scholars today, Feldman said, at least 3 to 1, and he said, I wouldn't be surprised if it were 5 to 1, said that Josephus mentioned Jesus there. Feldman reconstructed what he thinks Josephus said, and it basically says Jesus was a wise teacher, he gained followers from the Jews and Gentiles, he performed astonishing deeds, that Pilate, at the instigation of the Jewish leaders, crucified Jesus, his disciples continued in following him. Other scholars, like Robert von Vorst and Gert Tyson and Annette Mertz, are open to them, and some others are open to a toned-down version, rather than saying Jesus rose from the dead, to say that his disciples reported that he rose from the dead. To me, that makes more sense, because in that day, messianic movements were a dime a dozen, and when the Messiah was killed by the Romans, it just dispersed, and they found another Messiah, hopeful Messiah figure. So, but that's not what happened with the Christians. Their Christian movement exploded and grew exponentially after Jesus' death. The best way to explain it is their belief in the resurrection. Josephus was in Jerusalem during that time. He was interested in spiritual things because he became a Pharisee and a Jewish priest. So even though he wasn't a Christian, he's growing up in a Jewish family, a religious Jewish family, in Jerusalem, where the apostles are preaching these things. And so he certainly knows what the apostles are preaching, and it's mentioned in the text. So it just seems to me it makes more sense that the text said they reported he was alive, and Josephus, or the Christian, later doctored it up to say he was alive. rather than just saying the resurrection wasn't mentioned. But so that's the state of Josephus' scholarship on that passage. We'll never know for sure what Josephus actually wrote in that first passage. We can only guess. Right over there. And who would like to go next? If you raise your hand, then he can get to you. There are two guys up there.
You like talking about corroborating evidence a lot. What about the corroborating evidence of all the other Jesus-type figures around the Mediterranean and Middle East, like Horus, for example, is basically a clone of Jesus, or I guess vice versa, Jesus is a clone of Horus.
Well, actually, it's not. The stories are quite different. But, of course, you do have other stories of figures who die and then they return to life in different ways. This is what was called the School of Religions. That it was started back in the beginning of the 20th century. It became pretty popular around the 1930s and 40s. And then by the time you get into the 1950s, scholars began rejecting it, and it became very much rejected since the 1950s. It's popular on the internet today, of course, but you don't find it in many scholarly writings, and for good reason. In the year 2001, it resurfaced in the writings of a senior Swedish scholar named T.N.D. Medinger, who wrote a monograph called The Riddle of Resurrection. And he says in the beginning, in his introduction, he says, "It is a nearly universal consensus today among specialists that there are no dying and rising gods that predate Christianity." He says, but I'm going to, and he says, you're almost looked down as a weirdo if you think that there are. Now, this is amongst scholars who specialize in this. Again, this isn't internet stuff. This is people who study this for a living. And he says, but I'm going to take exception to this. I think that there are at least 3 and perhaps 5 dying and rising figures who predate Jesus. And he goes through and he names those 3, Osiris and Baal, and I think Tammuz was the third one. But when you look at these stories, they're what they are, and then he names 2 others. All of these they have to do with the agricultural cycles. So, in other words, why is there dryness in the summer where everything dies, and then in the spring when rain, everything comes to life? And it's kind of like when we were kids and there was thunder, we'd say, "Mom, what's that?" Well, it's the angels bowling in heaven. So it's kind of myth that's made up to explain the change of the agricultural cycles. And they would celebrate this myth every year in the spring when the crops would start to grow and you'd see green. So these figures were all in the distant past. Medinger goes on and he says, all right, in the end, in an appendix or an excursus, he says, what does this all have to do with Jesus? He says the difference is that these people claimed that they knew Jesus, that we know Jesus was a historical figure. These people who claimed to see that he rose from the dead, it was within their lifetime. We're not talking about a fictitious character in the distant, unnamed past. We're talking about someone, a historical character that people actually said they saw him, and it had nothing whatsoever to do with the agricultural cycles. And so he ends by saying the riddle remains. He says there's no prima facie reason for believing that the Christians copied off of these others. I would add a couple of other things to what Medinger said there. Number one, we know a number of the details that are often cited as parallels to Jesus, or with Jesus, to these others that predate. We know that they're true. So, for example, we know that Jesus performed astonishing deeds, not saying they were miracles, but we know that he performed astonishing deeds that he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms, and we know that he was crucified and died as a result. So it's really difficult to say that the Christians were copying off of other pagan religions when we know some of these things to be true of Jesus. A second thing I point out is that we can find parallels in just about anything. I mean, we're all aware of a plane that took off one morning from Massachusetts just after 9, and after 10 o'clock in the morning it flew into one of the tallest skyscrapers in the world in New York City, between the 78th and 80th floors, killing everybody on board. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, it's when the B-25 flew into the Empire State Building on July 28th, 1945. It's a true story. And that really occurred. Same stories as when the 767 flew into the South Tower on 9/11. You can even find symbolic stuff in here. 9/11, what is that? What do we call when we have an emergency? 911. The world, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, revisionist historians, 9/11 never happened. It was copying off the Empire State Building. How do we know this? 911. Second, same floors that they flew into. Third, the collapse of the World Trade Center towers were symbolic of the Great Recession in the United States that was just starting at that point. What about the one that crashed into the Pentagon? Well, that just showed that American military influence throughout the world had declined at this point. What about the one that crashed in the field? Well, it showed that the economic recession that was happening, and plus the decline of the government influence, was impacting the farmer and the average person out there. We can come up with some modern mythologizing for everything. Another thing I could point out, I think what this would involve with the early Christians making up these stories. The earliest Christians were pious Jews who said, they debated over the Jewish law, such as, could Christians eat meat sacrificed to idols now? Did Jewish Christians need to continue with temple purification rites? Did Gentile male Christians need to be circumcised? Could Jewish Christians even eat alongside of Gentile Christians? Now, if you're going to debate over the Jewish law, the minutiae to this extent, do you really think these same Christian leaders are going to engage in wholesale borrowing from pagan religions to form the very foundation of their own religious beliefs? Really? Finally, I'd point out that I think that we should expect stories of dying figures who come back to life. We should expect them throughout all of human history, fictitious stories. And the reason I say that is, most of us desire to experience romance. And most of us can experience romance. But in spite of that, we still see romantic comedies, romance novels, and all of this stuff that are going on. I mean, the big thing is mommy porn now, right? Where they read these romance novels. So you have these. Why? That doesn't mean that romance is unattainable. It just means it's a longing within the human heart. I think there's the same longing, even a deeper longing, that death doesn't end it for us. But I don't want to think about, I'll never see my mom again. I don't want to think that, when I die, that's it for me. I mean, some people don't care if that's the end for them. But I think most people don't want that to be an ending. And so I think we would expect to find stories of people dying and coming back to life, fictitious stories made up in order to provide encouragement and comfort in the face of death. But that doesn't mean that when we have really good historical evidence that this actually happened, the fact that you have fictitious stories don't disqualify actual stories any more than fictitious romance novels disqualify the fact that we can have romance. Would you like to push back on that some?
Yeah. I wouldn't, just to comment on that last part, I wouldn't see it as a romance so much as people's just fear of dying. I don't think they have like a romance for people coming back to life.
No, I said, I wasn't saying that way. I was saying we want to experience romance, and most people can experience romance, but in spite of that, we still have fictitious romantic stories that people like to watch because romance is a longing. I'm saying we should expect to see stories of people returning from the dead because...
Like Jesus.
Well, no, we've got really good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So, I mean, if you want to dispute the resurrection of Jesus, you're welcome to do that. Give me a reason. Attack some of the evidence that I've given. Or give me a hypothesis that better fulfills the criteria than the resurrection does.
I will. But another thing, you went on to talk about, I was going back to the original question, the corroborating between Horus and Jesus. You specified on the resurrection, but they have so much more things in common. I mean, just besides, you really can't claim it as just a happy coincidence as some certain parallels. They both resurrected a man. One was named Lazarus, the other was El-Azarus, which translates to Hebrew as Lazarus. They were both born on December 25th.
But wait, how do you know that?
The Egyptians' holy book.
And it says it translates to Lazarus?
Literally, yeah, it's El-Azarus.
How do you know that means Lazarus?
Because people know how to speak Egyptian and people know how to speak Hebrew. I don't understand.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'd like to have a reference for that, but that's okay.
Okay.
Go
Well,
ahead.
I mean, it's in the
What's some
book.
of the other parallels?
All right. They were both born December 25th.
All right, the first account we have of Jesus being born on December 25th is in the year 339, and we really don't know when Jesus was historically born. We certainly, the earliest Christians didn't think Jesus was born on December 25th, so that's not really a legitimate parallel.
They both claim. They also died and were raised 3 days later.
Okay.
Except Jesus went to hell and Horus. Born of virgins, both of them. Isis.
Horus
for
was born of
Horus.
a virgin.
Isis, yeah, his mother.
Okay.
And Jesus, Mary.
Okay.
I mean, they cured the sick. They walked on water. They were all called the light, the way, the Lamb, the truth. The Son of God, Horus, the son of Ra. I mean, there's just a lot of parallels, corroborating evidence where it doesn't seem like it's just.
Horus was also Isis. Horus was also Isis's husband. So it was her husband and her brother. So, and he wasn't crucified. Horus was killed by his brother.
Yeah.
And then he feared that Isis would bring him back to life. And so he chopped them up in 14 pieces and scattered them throughout the world. Isis goes to try to find him. And she only finds 13 of the 14 pieces. You can guess which piece she didn't find. And she puts them all together, and she brings him back to life in the underworld. He never comes back to life and visits Earth. So she buries him. He comes back to life in the underworld, where he becomes God of the mummies. So I wouldn't call that a resurrection. He doesn't appear to anyone. He never comes back to Earth. He's just given life in the afterlife, which is a gray, shadowy existence. So, I mean, Osiris or Horus, the same person, they come back to life. It's the same, it's more of a zombification than it is a resurrection.
Isn't that what the physical resurrection you're talking about?
No, because he never came back to life.
Well, didn't you say that Jesus would take his followers and take their souls back into their corpses? That
Yep.
kind of seems like zombies to me.
Well, but he raises them from the dead and transforms them.
Oh, he
So-
transforms them after.
That's
okay.
right.
So like the
So
ones that have decomposed completely, he can transform their bodies back.
Yeah, why not? If Christianity is true, if God can create the universe out of nothing, then what's the problem with him bringing corpses back to life and transforming them? The thing is, all the parallels that you're giving here with Horus, they're not all true. That some of these are made up. I'm not saying you made them up. They come from online, because if you look at Mettinger's work and you look at stuff written by scholars, you don't find those same details. So that's why I'm challenging you. Give me primary sources, not stuff you read on the internet. Give me a primary source that lists this story. In fact, you can email me on my website, risenjesus.com, and if I'm wrong, I will post this on my website. I have retracted stuff and admitted errors. You can go on there where I had an article I wrote last year that said, I forgot, but I said I was wrong in this, and something I wrote in a book back in 2004. Someone pointed out to me, I acknowledge it. Pointed out to me, give me some primary ancient sources that have all these details that you mentioned, and I'll say I'm wrong, and I'll put it on my website, risenjesus.com, but you're not going to find any. You'll find a few of those things that you mentioned, but there are not enough there. A lot of these things are just made up by people on the internet, and they're just simply not true.
Is that right? You heard?
Yeah, hi. I'm James Rohr, and I'm a history professor here at UNK. I appreciate your approach very much, and I share your faith. I believe that the resurrection of Jesus Christ indeed did happen. I noticed that in your approach, you focus in, and I think very wisely, on the letters of Paul. I used to teach at a Christian college, and one of the history students that was working with me said, you know, Dr. Rohr, historians, we're supposed to write narratives and describe stuff. And so how would you describe, if you were writing this, what the disciples saw? When, as you move from Paul into the Gospels, it seems as though there's different categories of sightings, that they're not they're not dealing with the exact same kind of resurrection appearance. And you, I think I know what you might say, but I don't know. But I'd like to ask you that. How do you account for what seems to be kind of, at times, categorical differences in the nature of the resurrection sightings or the resurrection appearances as you move from Paul
Can you give me an example?
to the Gospels? You don't have the bodily appearance of Paul. He references raised from the body.
Yeah.
But in his Damascus Road account, you have the light, you have the voice.
Yeah.
And so what my student was asking was, with these different sources, why don't they have the same experience that they're reporting? And if you're a historian and somebody's saying, well, what did it look like? You know, you're a historian, you want to narrate it.
Yeah.
What would you write? And I'd just like to run that question past you.
A fair question. Remember, Paul in his letters never, let him have just in case he wants to follow up with that. Paul never describes the appearance in his undisputed, he doesn't describe it in any of the 13 letters, the appearance to Paul. We find the appearance in the book of Acts. And the book of Acts is written, of course, by the same author as the Gospel of Luke. That appearance is in Acts chapter 9, 22, and 26. But remember, it's a post-ascension appearance. So Luke didn't see any problem with, he saw a difference in the nature of that appearance. It's a glorified appearance from Jesus in heaven to Paul because it's post-ascension. It's a few years after. Whereas in the Gospels, it was right after the tomb, the empty tomb. You got resurrection there. So the way it's narrated in Acts it's just different than because it's post-ascension. So, the scriptures say that after Jesus ascended to heaven, he was glorified by God in heaven. So I don't know how all that changed as soon as he entered into heaven, or what's Jesus' body like now. I don't know how to answer that. As historians, of course, we can't. We could narrate how that might happen, but we have to admit that's where we're getting beyond what we can prove.
Right.
And we're setting that narrative, which is true or false to varying degrees. What do you think about that?
I just wanted to, I thought you were going to say that it's pre-ascension, post-ascension. And you've confirmed what I thought you would say.
Okay. Let me ask you one question. You're a history professor here.
Yes.
Okay. So you got a PhD in history, right?
Right.
All right. Now, the article yesterday had a couple professors saying that I wasn't going to do history. Did I do history tonight?
I would say you did.
Okay.
I don't know if, I don't think any of my colleagues are here. I don't know what they would say.
Well, they weren't history professors.
I didn't read the article that you're referring to. I have to confess my ignorance on that. But I like very much the way that you set up the criteria for best explanation. And I think it's a very persuasive presentation. I think that there are people who have a priori ideological commitments that would automatically rule it out simply because they have an a priori ideological commitment.
Right.
But that's not history, because history isn't grounded upon a priori ideological commitments. It's
Yeah.
grounded upon a commitment to evidence.
Good way of putting it. Thank you. Someone else? Was there anyone up there that we might be missing? Okay.
My question is regarding history too, and it has to do with Karl Popper, the critical rationalist. Karl Popper in the 1940s, he was fed up of Christians condemning him to hell and that kind of stuff. So he wrote an article about critical examination, and in the article he said, there are different schools of thought that have masters. And their doctrines bind disciples and students with chains. However, there will come a point where the students will try to free themselves from the chain, and they will eventually break loose. But, he said, the shocking thing about these students is that they still refuse to critically examine their doctrines and question their masters, but rather they say that their way is right, you know. So my question to you is, what, you know, if Dr. Popper were here and he were to ask you, you know, what makes you, the things you do different from the things that Leibniz did, for example? You know, Leibniz went around doing the same kind of stuff, justifying, using sufficient reason. So what makes you different from all those people? And give me a reason, you know, why I should think that, you know, you're just one of those students who's broken free from the chain, but is still within, still conditioned by it and refusing to examine it critically.
Yeah, fair question. So in essence, if I could just summarize that, you were saying, all right, we're all biased. We're all stuck in our ways of thinking, right? So how can I know what I believe is true? And how can you know that what you believe is true? To an extent, in order to arrive at a conclusion, we're going to have to try to come outside and transcend our own horizon, our worldview, our biases. And if we're really after truth, we're going to try to do that. Now, I describe in my book how I took 6 steps at trying to transcend my own horizon and bias. You can't get out of it completely. One thing I think you'll agree is there's no such thing as a completely objective historian. You can't be completely objective. You can't be completely neutral. We are all guided and influenced by things such as our race, gender, ethics, nationality, our political, theological, philosophical convictions, the way we were raised, the academic institutions we attended, the very group of people whose acceptance and respect we desire. There's no way around that. We can take certain steps to minimize that. And you know, I worked very seriously at that. I can remember my wife saying to me, she woke me up one night and we were laying in bed, and we'd been laying in bed for about half an hour. I thought she was asleep. And then I heard her voice say, "You're doubting again, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "What do you believe?" I said, "I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure God exists. That's about all I'm certain about." Why? Because I was really working hard to transcend my horizon at that point. None of us can do it completely. But that doesn't mean we can't be adequately objective by purposefully setting aside our desired outcome while our investigations proceed. A physician can't get a completely sterile environment, but that doesn't mean we do surgery in a sewer. In the same way, a historian is never going to be able to become completely objective, but you can try really, really hard. Most historians never even make the first attempt to become objective and unbiased. They just think they are, and everybody else is biased. What I've done here is I've presented you a historical argument. Could I be wrong? I could be wrong. But that's why I subjected this to unsympathetic people. That's why I did peer review process. That's why I did public debate, so I could see what the best of the skeptics had to offer. And when I saw that, at least in my opinion, they didn't have much, that increased my confidence that the route that I was looking at, the position I took, is true. Now, it doesn't mean I'm going to win their approval or going to win them over to my way of thinking. You know, it'd be nice if they did, but if it isn't, that's not my problem. So ultimately, in the end, none of us can be 100% objective. We're going to have to make our own decisions based on an honest investigation. If we're really after truth, we're going to make an honest investigation, and we're going to go with what we think is the best explanation. And that's about the best that we can do. You want to follow up with that?
So it's kind of like Schrodinger's cat, where it might be dead or it might not be dead. You know, it totally depends on your perception of it.
Well, no, either Jesus rose or he didn't, right?
Uh-huh.
I mean, God exists or he doesn't exist. You can't have it both ways. It's the law of excluded middle. Either Jesus rose or he didn't rise from the dead. I think the historical evidence points to his resurrection.
About that, you know, about those steps, I don't know, correct me if you're wrong, but the authenticity, the plausibility, and the accuracy of any phenomena, any historical phenomena, or any phenomena per se, is directly dependent on one, validity, and the other is reliability. Now, considering the circumstances of the 11 disciples, you know, at that point in time, do you really think because much of phenomena is dependent on those two factors, do you really think that 11 people claiming that they saw Jesus rise from the dead is either valid and reliable? Because David Hume, in his treatise on human nature, makes it pretty clear when he says that to come up with illusions is not new to mankind.
Yeah.
They will believe in anything and can be persuaded to believe in anything. So, how is it valid and how is it reliable historically, considering the fact that at that point in time, those things, those people were rather susceptible to believe in those kind of things.
As they are today as well.
Yes,
That's why we look at evidence. That's why we look at things such as there were group of experiences. They weren't hallucinations. That's why you look at something like Paul, who was a skeptic who converted because he believed Jesus appeared to him. You formulate hypotheses, you subject those hypotheses to the best explanation. So, what's your hypothesis?
Well, sociologically, if you look at religion, all the religions.
Did they hallucinate? Were they lying? What's your hypothesis?
I think they're lying.
Okay,
Lying.
so they died. They all were willing to suffer continuously for a known lie.
Well, again, that kind of thing is not uncommon.
It's not uncommon. Can you give me one example of a
Yes.
group of people who died for something they knew was false?
Yes, look at the Nazis.
They believed it was true.
No, if you were to personally examine how many Nazi soldiers out of, you can't possibly think that all of the Nazi soldiers agreed with what Hitler did. But,
Okay, I'll agree with that. However, then they died under compulsion.
Okay,
The disciples didn't die under compulsion. They willingly died for proclaiming something they believed was true. They could have dropped out any time. The Nazi soldiers could not have dropped out at any time.
Well, but how would as a historian and not actually being there, that they died willfully? Who is to say that there wasn't any other factor there?
It's a possibility, you're right. It's a possibility, but historians go by probabilities.
Okay.
We have to go by probabilities, and there's not a single report that said that these guys unwillingly died because they thought it was false. And you've got Paul, who converted. He went from climbing the ladder, was in a pretty good position, and then he converts to something that he previously thought was a cult, and then suffers throughout his ministry for probably 2 to 3 decades, and then dies as a martyr for something he knows is false. What possible benefit did he have?
Let me tell you a little story. I was raised a Hindu, and your knowledge of Hinduism is like, you said that like a Hindu, you could be born again and again. Now, when you say that, that is not Hinduism. That is merely the end of the Vedas. That is the Vedanta. The Vedas are totally different. Out of the 12 Vedas, 9 of them have no room for God. So it is, at most, you can say that it's deistic in nature, but it is certainly not, your perception of what your perception of Hinduism is. So in Hindu, post the Vedantas, there's a story there of a person.
So are you saying that Hinduism does not teach reincarnation?
No, I'm not saying that. That is.
Well, then you're not saying I'm wrong there.
No, that is not the essence. That is not the 100%.
Hold on just a second, okay? Because I do want to give some others a chance. So your hypothesis is that the disciples and Paul lied about this. Which, by the way, I don't know of a single scholar today who holds that position.
Well, again, one of the beautiful facts of history is falsification. I don't know. But
People do lie, but they also tell the truth. There are bad witnesses and there are good witnesses. The fact that there are bad witnesses doesn't mean all are bad witnesses. And if we go by David Hume's thing and question witnesses and say they're always untrustworthy, we couldn't establish anything from the past. Throw out everything we know about the Roman Republic and ancient Greece. Caesar must not have crossed the Rubicon because we don't have any good people, because everybody lies and distorts truth. So I just don't find that very persuasive. If you want to hold it, that's fine. But these guys were willing to suffer continuously, all of them, for something they knew was false. And again, maybe there were a couple of them that, died for some, maybe they didn't want to, and the Romans didn't let them out of it. Problem is, we don't have a shred of evidence for it, and we've got to go with the evidence we have. But I do appreciate your objections, and really, thanks for hanging in there and pushing back, and you too. And we can come back to you if nobody else has something. Right up there at the top.
I'm accepting tips after the show.
Dr. Licona, on your study of textual evidence, can you go there at all as far as the 1st, 2nd Corinthians? In your studies, what have you found to support that in the textual evidence?
What do you mean the textual evidence?
Well, what exists for us?
What manuscripts?
And the evidence to support that.
What manuscript, actual physical manuscripts we have? Gosh, I don't know for the particular ones, to be honest with you. There was a book that came out last year published by Oxford University Press. It was like $130 for hardback, and so I'm waiting for the soft cover to come out this summer for $50. But it breaks down for the New Testament all of the 27 books and letters of the New Testament and what manuscripts we have particularly for them in terms of the earliest ones. So I can't speak for each one. What I can say that for the New Testament as a whole, we, as of September of last year, we now have 5,838 Greek manuscripts. We have between 9 and 15 of them that are dated to within 150 years of the original. The average size of that manuscript is 459 pages. The oldest manuscript we have is the John Ryland's P52 papyri, a fragment of the Gospel of John that's dated from between 5 and 60 years of the original. The second best out there is the Homeric epics, Homer's Odyssey and Iliad. And for that, we have just under 2,000 manuscripts. By the way, the 5,838, that's Greek manuscripts alone. Then you have Latin, Coptic, Syriac, and Ethiopic, and all these others, and thousands and tens of thousands more. Just the original Greek I'm talking about, 5,830. The Iliad and Odyssey, just under 2,000. The earliest is about 350 years after the original. So what we have for the New Testament is just amazing in terms of the purity of the text that we can get back. There's not even a close second place, and the Homeric epics is second. But the particular manuscripts for 1 Corinthians, I couldn't name that, but it is in that book that I'm going to get this summer. One more, and then I'm seeing we're out of time, but I will stay here afterward and answer questions. So if nobody else, we'll let this guy again, but if someone else who hasn't asked a question would like to. Okay, right here. I'll remain after if you want to ask some. We can talk as long as you want. And I do appreciate you pushing back.
I'm going to lob you an easy one here.
Oh, don't give me an easy one.
Why do you care if people believe it?
Well, if the Christian message is true, and I think it is, if it's not true, we're wasting our time. And if it weren't true, I'd like to get out of it, you know? I don't want to follow it if it's not true. If the Christian message is true, and if the resurrection happened, it suggests it's true, then that means eternal life is possible. It means that because there's a lot of injustices and darkness and evil in the world, that someday God's going to make that all right. It means that I'm going to see my mom again, and my dad again, my grandparents. It means that heaven's possible. It's the best news one could have. So I don't mean to sound preaching, but I mean, that's just my own reason why, honestly, if a person doesn't believe, that's their problem, not mine. I'm not, it's no sweat off my back. So that's up to them. I just hope we'll all seek truth and let's hope that we can find it.